The story is legendary. Saul of Tarsus, a persecutor of the faithful, is struck down on the road to Damascus, only to rise as Paul, the chosen apostle, a humble tentmaker, traveling the ancient world, spreading the word of a resurrected Savior through simple, heartfelt letters to fledgling communities. Yeah, it's a great story. It's got drama, a character arc, everything you'd want in a good myth. And for centuries, that's the image we've been sold. Paul, the working-class hero of early Christianity. Simple, direct, inspired. But, and you knew there was a but coming, have you actually read the letters attributed to this guy? I mean, really sat down and read them. Because if you do, that simple, humble image starts to fall apart, and it falls apart fast. These texts aren't simple. They're dense, they're layered, and they're packed with sophisticated rhetorical tricks and high-level philosophical arguments. The author is debating the very nature of wisdom, knowledge, and the human condition. So this is the central puzzle we're tackling today. How does a supposed tentmaker from Tarsus, with no recorded formal training in philosophy, end up writing like a seasoned Greek intellectual debating in the schools of Athens? Where did this guy get his classical education? Was he secretly auditing lectures between sewing goat skins? It's a huge contradiction. And when you see a contradiction that big, it usually means the story you've been told isn't the real story. Not even close. So, if the author of these letters wasn't a simple tent maker, then who were they? Well, to figure that out, we have to follow the evidence. We have to become literary detectives. And our first clue is the specific flavor of philosophy that permeates these texts. It's not just vague musings. It's a direct engagement with one of the biggest philosophical movements of the ancient world, Stoicism. Now, if you're not familiar with Stoicism, think of it as the ancient equivalent of a mega-popular self-help and wellness movement. They were everywhere. The Stoics were obsessed with logic, virtue, and understanding one's place in the cosmos. They had big ideas about what it meant to be a good and wise person. Therefore, when we look at 1 Corinthians, we have to look for the source of all this philosophical language. And what we find isn't just a vague similarity, it's a direct parallel. The author isn't just accidentally sounding like a Stoic, they're playing on the same field using the same rulebook. You see that? The central conflict the author sets up in the opening chapters of 1 Corinthians is all about defining wisdom. The community is supposedly divided into factions, and what's the core of their disagreement? A denunciation of some kind of wisdom, as scholar Timothy Brookins puts it in his book, Rediscovering the Wisdom of the Corinthians. The fingerprints are all over the crime scene. The author is obsessed with defining the wise man and the wisdom of the world. These weren't niche topics. They were the absolute headline acts for every Stoic philosopher from Zeno to Seneca. It's like finding a modern text debating mindfulness and living in the now and trying to pretend the author had never heard of modern wellness culture. It's just not plausible. Okay, so the author of 1 Corinthians is clearly swimming in the same philosophical pool as the Stoics. Case closed, right? The writer was just a Stoic who happened to be into this new Jesus movement. But, and this is the twist that makes this whole text so brilliant, the author isn't promoting Stoicism. They're not writing a fan letter. They are taking the most popular philosophy of the day, looking it right in the eye, and hijacking it for a completely different purpose. This isn't just a friendly debate. It's what scholars like Timothy Brookins call a polemical appropriation. That's a fancy term for a simple and ruthless strategy. Take your opponent's language and turn it into a weapon to use against them. It's like a political opponent taking a nickname they were given as an insult and printing it on their own campaign t-shirts to take away its power. And the author of 1 Corinthians is a master of this. They see that some people in the Corinthian community are puffing themselves up, probably calling themselves wise men in that very technical Stoic sense, believing they had achieved perfection through their own inherent divine reason. So, what does the author do? They make the character of Paul essentially agree with them, but with a thick layer of sarcasm. The author has Paul say things like, "If any of you thinks he is a wise man in this age, he must become a fool to be truly wise. Is it possible that there is nobody among you wise enough to judge a dispute between believers?" You can almost hear the eye roll in the text. He's granting them the title they use for themselves, wise man, but he's reappropriating it, as Brookins notes, to make it pejorative. He's turning their badge of honor into a mark of arrogance. It's a devastatingly effective literary move. The author isn't trying to win a philosophical debate on Stoic terms. They're changing the game entirely. They're taking the Corinthians' own Stoic way of thinking and turning it against them to show how their wisdom is actually foolishness. This is the genius part. The author isn't just disagreeing with the Stoics. They're taking the Corinthians' own philosophy, this Stoic idea of being a wise man, and using it as a weapon against them. It's like the author is saying, "Oh, you think you're wise? Let me show you what real wisdom looks like, and spoiler alert, it has nothing to do with your self-satisfied logic." So the question then becomes, if they're tearing down the Stoic ideal of the wise man, what are they building in its place? So if you're a writer trying to start a new religious movement, and you've just spent a bunch of time rhetorically dismantling the most popular philosophical system of your day, you can't just leave a vacuum. You have to offer a replacement. You have to give your followers a new ladder to climb, a new prize to win. Therefore, after tearing down the Stoic ideal of the wise man, the author of 1 Corinthians built a new system right on top of the old one's foundations. It's a brilliant move. The author essentially creates a new spiritual hierarchy, a new way for insiders to feel special and superior. Let's break it down. For the Stoics, the ultimate goal was virtue. That was it. Things like health, wealth, and power were considered indifferent. The only thing that really mattered was using your divine reason to live a virtuous life. It was a very internal, intellectual pursuit. The Stoics had this whole model of the universe where divine reason, or pneuma, which is the Greek word for spirit, infuses everything at different levels. Rocks just hold together. Plants grow. Animals can also move and perceive. But humans were special. We had that top-tier infusion, the rational level, that let us pursue virtue. Now, watch what the author of Corinthians does. They borrow this exact structure, but swap out the labels to create their own tiered system within the church. See that? As Professor Brookins points out, the author creates a new two-tiered system. At the bottom, you have the psychicus, or the unspiritual person. This term is directly related to the lower soulish level of tension in Stoic physics, the level of animals. The author is basically telling the immature believers in the church that they're operating on a lower spiritual frequency. But at the top, that's the new ideal. Not the rational man, but the pneumaticus, the spiritual man. And their defining quality isn't achieving virtue through reason. It's the ability to manifest the spirit, which, according to the text, often meant flashy things like speaking in tongues. So what's the result? It's not just a philosophical debate, it's the creation of a new spiritual class system, a new in-group. The Stoics said the goal was to be a perfectly rational human, something you could achieve with the tool you were born with. The author of Corinthians says, no, the goal is to be a spiritual human, a status defined by the group's leaders. And surprise, surprise, only some people get to join that exclusive club. This is how you build a religion. You don't just tell people what to believe. You give them a structure, a way to measure themselves, and a clear path to feeling superior to everyone else. Okay, let's just take a step back and appreciate what we've seen so far. The author of 1 Corinthians didn't just write a letter. They engaged with a major philosophical system, took its core concepts, turned them inside out with sarcastic wit, and then built a new, tiered spiritual hierarchy to replace it. It's a brilliant piece of literary and rhetorical work, truly. But, and this is the big one, folks, this raises a massive, flashing neon red flag about the traditional story we're all told. We're supposed to believe this was all written in the 50s CE by a working class tent maker traveling around the Middle East. I mean, come on. Does this sound like a guy who made tents for a living? Or does it sound like a highly educated, Greek speaking intellectual playing 4D chess with philosophy to win over a sophisticated urban audience? The level of education required to pull this off just doesn't fit the character profile, not even a little. And this is where the whole timeline for the Pauline letters starts to look really, really shaky. Because when you ask a simple question, what is our earliest physical or historical evidence for these letters, you find something shocking. The traditional story places the letters right here, in the 50s and maybe early 60s CE. But then you get nothing. Decades of silence. No mention from other writers, no copies found, nothing. The first person to show up in the historical record with a collection of letters attributed to a guy named Paul is this man, Marcion of Sinope. And he doesn't appear until the mid-2nd century, around the year 140. That's almost 100 years after they were supposedly written. Think about that. For nearly a century, the supposedly foundational texts of Christianity are just nowhere to be found. This is exactly what scholars like Dr. Nina Livesey discuss in her book, The Letters of Paul in Their Roman Literary Context. The Pauline letters fit perfectly into a genre of literature that was hugely popular in the 2nd century. Fictive letter collections. These were works of fiction, written in the name of a famous figure to give them authority. It was a common and well-known literary device. So what's more likely? That a tent maker in the 50s CE spontaneously developed a theology that perfectly mirrored and subverted Greek philosophy, and his letters just happened to vanish for a century? Or that a brilliant anonymous author in the 2nd century created the character of Paul and wrote these sophisticated letters to address the theological debates of their time, not the 50s? When you look at the evidence, the second option makes a whole lot more sense. So let's put all the pieces on the table. We started with the traditional story of a simple tent maker, but the texts themselves showed us a sophisticated author skilled in Greek philosophy. We saw that the author wasn't just familiar with Stoicism, they were actively hijacking its concepts to win arguments. Therefore, they created a new spiritual hierarchy to replace the old one, giving their followers a new in-group to belong to. But the timeline for this supposed 1st century figure doesn't hold up. The evidence only appears in the 2nd century, right when this exact type of literature was popular. Therefore, when you follow the evidence instead of tradition, you arrive at a much more rational conclusion. The Pauline epistles aren't a historical record. They're not eyewitness accounts from the dawn of Christianity written by a man who met a celestial Jesus. What they are is a brilliant literary creation, a masterpiece of religious propaganda, and I mean that as a compliment to the author's skill. We're looking at a work of sophisticated pseudonymous fiction, likely written in the mid-2nd century by a highly educated author, or maybe even a school of authors. Their goal was clear: to create an authoritative founding figure, this character called Paul, and put in his mouth the doctrines and arguments needed to shape a growing religious movement. And what was the best tool for the job in a world steeped in Greek culture? You use the language of the dominant philosophy, Stoicism, to show that your new system is superior. The purpose of these letters wasn't to record history, it was to make theology. It was to take a character made famous in other narratives like the Book of Acts and give him a deeper, more philosophical voice, to settle the arguments of a later time. When you stop trying to shoehorn these texts into a history that doesn't fit and instead appreciate them for what they are, incredibly effective pieces of literature, everything clicks into place. So there you have it. The character of Paul, less of a 1st century apostle, more of a 2nd century philosophical debate champion. And honestly, isn't that a much more interesting and rational explanation? It treats the authors as the clever, educated people they clearly were, not just as stenographers for a divine voice. The big takeaway here is that you can apply this kind of critical thinking to any sacred text. Whether it's the Bible, the Quran, the Vedas, these books weren't beamed down from space. They were written by people. People with agendas, people with arguments to win, and people who used the most powerful literary and philosophical tools of their day to make their case. So next time someone hands you a religious text, don't just ask what it says. Ask why it was written that way, what tools the author used, and who they were trying to convince. That's where the real story is. Thinking critically is the best tool we've got. If you agree and you enjoy this deep dive, do me a favor and hit that like button. It really helps the channel out. Make sure you're subscribed and have the bell icon clicked so you don't miss our next investigation. And I want to hear from you. What other religious texts use the philosophy of their time to make an argument? Drop your thoughts in the comments below. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay rational.